express appreciation for the role that we played 4.5 years ago. I'll always believe, by God's grace, we did our duty on that fateful day. But when it came to Vice President Cheney, when we were here for a funeral not long ago, and he leaned over next to me and just said to me in his usual terse manner, he said, "You did the right thing." And I said, "Dick, I'll always cherish that, and I always will." Look, he was a man of principle. He was a conservative who never wavered, whether he was serving the people of Wyoming, whether he was serving alongside a president. He was a champion for the conservative agenda that's animated my life, and I think this nation will remember him as an extraordinary public service who contributed mightily to the life of the nation and to the principles I hold dear.
And finally, we are here at the funeral memorial service for the former vice president. I won't ask you specifically about President Trump and President Vance not being invited here to the service, but I will ask you about the others across the political parties that are here. And where do you see bipartisanship in Washington going from here? Because in a lot of ways, as we watch the folks that walk in here, it's almost a vestige of the past in Washington, watching who is sitting inside of that cathedral today.
Well, look, I don't live in Washington anymore. I live in Indiana. And I can tell you, our politics is more divided now than any time in my lifetime, but I'm not convinced our nation is as divided as our politics. And I think what you'll see today in the National Cathedral is men and women from every political background who are going to come together to honor a man with some will be there because, like me, they agree strongly with his principles and his values. Others will be people that fought him along the way. But that foundation of respect for a lifetime of public service and integrity is going to be celebrated here today. And that really, I think, that's how most Americans feel, and that's a foundation we can build on.
Vice President Pence, it's good to see you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Take care today. All righty. Appreciate it.
The funeral service for former Vice President Dick Cheney will get underway soon at Washington National Cathedral. Former President Joe Biden, former First Lady Jill Biden, and they are expected to attend along with former President George W. Bush and Cheney's daughter, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who's expected to deliver remarks. Joining us now from outside the cathedral is MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, what can you tell us?
Hey, good morning, Mika. We are watching guests here arriving. This funeral service is slated to begin in just over an hour for now. For folks that are watching those shots inside, we've been keeping track of who has been arriving so far, and we've seen the likes of John Brennan, John Bolton, Bill Kristol, also as well as Scooter Libby, of course, the close aide to former Vice President Dick Cheney. This is a moment here where you are seeing a collection of folks from across political parties who are involved in Washington D.C. governance over the last 5 decades. If you look at Dick Cheney's life, he came into the Oval Office for the first time in his early 30s as Deputy Chief of Staff to then President Gerald Ford. He was Deputy Chief of Staff to Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld. And then 30 years later, he would return to the Oval Office as the Vice President of the United States to George Bush. The Bush family, as well as the Biden family, will be at the funeral service today, as well as every living vice president, including Kamala Harris, Dan Quayle, Mike Pence, and Al Gore. Among those who were not invited, I am told, include the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, as well as J.D. Vance, the vice president. Vice President Vance is going to begin a fireside chat just down the road with Breitbart, a podcast here over the next few minutes. This is quite a moment. Dick Cheney, folks will recall, back in 2022, ahead of the re-election campaign of his daughter, Liz Cheney, cut a television ad in which he made very clear, while talking about Donald Trump, in our nation's 246-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. He tried to steal the last election using lies and violence to keep himself in power after the voters had rejected him. He is a coward. The vice president's residency, where Dick Cheney lived for 8 years, is less than a mile down the road from here at the National Cathedral in Washington. During this service here, among those who will be paying tribute to the life of the former vice president will be his longtime cardiologist, who became a friend, and the two men co-authored a book together, as well as Pete Williams, our longtime friend and colleague here at MSNBC and NBC News, the former justice correspondent, who, when we talk about Dick Cheney's life, Mika, folks should recall that he served in Congress for 10 years from Wyoming, which is where our Pete Williams was from as well. He served as an aide in Congress to Dick Cheney before going to the Pentagon to serve as an aide to him there when Dick Cheney became the Secretary of Defense.
Transpired with that riot at the Capitol and Pence holding his ground despite the chance of hang Mike Pence, and he said that Dick Cheney told him you did the right thing. That was something that was meaningful to him, and he says, the two shared principles and values, part of the old Republican Guard. Back with us is MS Now's Vaughn Hilliard, who's there at the cathedral. Vaughn, as we listen to this beautiful music, we see former President Bush perhaps wiping away tears or wiping his nose. So it seems like it is a solemn atmosphere there. Can you give us a feeling of the people who are walking in those doors this morning?
Yeah, it's quite something here in Washington, D.C. I think it's worth noting the Washington Cathedral is less than a mile from the U.S. Naval Observatory, where, of course, Dick Cheney called home for the 8 years that he served as vice president. And watching the folks who have walked into the cathedral here over the last hour that are now sitting there in the pews represent American governance over the last 5 decades, from the time that the vice president first entered the Oval Office in his early 30s as deputy chief of staff to then President Gerald Ford. He was serving as deputy chief of staff to the chief of staff, Donald Rumsfeld, who, of course, was a close figure to him. The two men served, as Rumsfeld served as Department of Defense Secretary during the Bush administration. And in so many ways, what we heard from Dick Cheney was a defense of the administration's decisions to his passing, and that he had one chance at that to keep America safe, and the decisions that were made by the administration were done with that at the forefront of their minds. And when you look at the individuals that are there today, you see individuals that have come under scrutiny themselves. John Brennan is in the room. John Bolton is in the room. Scooter Libby. Of course, Vice President Pence, Vice President Kamala Harris, bipartisan members of Congress, the Bush family. And in so many ways, when you look at the arc and the life of Dick Cheney, he served in so many capacities. For 10 years, he represented the state of Wyoming in Congress. He served on the Intelligence Committee, was the ranking member through the Iran-Contra hearings. And then ultimately, he became the Secretary of Defense himself under the George H.W. Bush administration. When you look at in 2000, that George W. Bush, who had just become the Republican nominee for the presidency, had tapped him to lead the search committee and ultimately to find his VP. And then it was the Texas governor that asked Dick Cheney to fill that role himself. He had been serving 5 years previously as the CEO of the major oil company, and pushed that aside in order to serve in the capacity as vice president. And when you look at the arc in the life, he was very forceful in his defense of the enhanced interrogation tactics that were used, and that the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately even found that the Bush administration had violated the Geneva Conventions. But in the years after leaving office, he continued to defend and effectively making the case that credit was not given for the would-be attacks that people never became aware of because of the efforts of the administration. And so in so many ways, today's ceremony, I think, is representative of decisions that have come before previous administrations, not just the Bush administration, and the decisions that they have made in that tension between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And as you heard there from Vice President Pence just a few moments ago, telling us that in so many ways he was reflective of his own VP tenure there after serving in Congress himself, watching then VP Cheney serving in the capacity inside the White House that he would fill 16 years later under Donald Trump.
Folks, you can see there that Trump, his mission was to ruin the Cheney funeral, and it was basically blocked from even entering the building. Security would basically say, "Sir, you're not welcome here." Same thing to J.D. Vance. I think that's quite fascinating. And look, I'm not a Dick Cheney defender, and I think it was a mistake, honestly, to bring him on the Harris campaign. And I think it was probably a mistake to involve Liz Cheney as much as she was. I understand why she was included, but to make her like a centerpiece of the campaign, it misunderstood the Republican base. But here's the thing. I do think it's quite fascinating that Trump isn't even welcome in the den of this evil Republican. And Dick Cheney was evil. I think we have to reckon with that fact, right? Like, what he did should never be forgiven because he never took responsibility for it. You know, what he did, lying to enter America into one of the most disastrous wars of the last 50 years. Obviously, it's terrible. But here's the thing. That's Donald Trump's people. He wants to be accepted among the evil people of the world, right? He wants to be accepted by these people. This is yet another example, guys. Another example. Not of Trump being, he's a non-neocon war hawk. He's a different kind of Republican. That's not true. Trump wants to be accepted by the Romneys and the Cheneys and the Bushes of the world. Just like he wants to be accepted by the Obamas and Clintons and Bidens of the world. He wanted to always be in the club. And the club is like the rich people that dominate American society and crush the working class regardless of party. Remember those pictures that Trump used to be in sometimes, right? Pictures of him and Hillary and Bill and Melania showcasing that there was a kind of alliance of an elite above us all, right? And he's not in those clubs anymore, and he was never truly welcome in those clubs. We've talked about the insecurity of Donald Trump. The insecurity of how he likes to pretend to care about the people who live in, poorer red states when he despises his voters. And the people he actually likes are people in New York, people in LA, people in Chicago. These are the people he likes. People in the big cities who are liberals and progressives. And the Republicans he likes are the classy Republicans like Romney and Bush and Cheney. These people hate him. And even when they're dead, they don't want him around.